James Parker sat on his porch that late September afternoon, the kind of golden evening when the woods behind his house glowed with amber light. He polished his father's old hunting rifle, careful and methodical, just as he had been trained in the army years ago. Hunting wasn't just a pastime for James, it was heritage. His grandfather had hunted those same woods back in the 1950s, long before the neighborhood subdivisions and homeowners associations had sprung up around them. The land wasn't just a property line on a map. It was family history, a connection to the earth, and a reminder of the men who'd come before him. When he finished wiping down the rifle, James stood and stretched, listening to the distant rustle of deer moving through the underbrush. He smiled to himself. Tomorrow morning, he'd set out early like always, coffee in his thermos, his boots crunching on the frosted ground. That was his ritual, and nothing, at least, so he thought, could disturb it. But then he checked the mailbox. Inside was a crisp white envelope, heavier than most, stamped with the official seal of the Community Homeowners Association. He carried it back to the porch, frowning, and tore it open. His eyes narrowed as he read the first few lines. Notice of violation, unauthorized hunting within community grounds. Fine. $1,500. James read it twice, then a third time, as though the words might rearrange themselves into something that made sense. But no, the message was clear. The HOA had fined him for hunting on his own land. A slow heat spread through his chest. His property was 20 acres passed down from his father, who had fought hard to keep it when developers carved the rest of the forest into tidy streets lined with cookie-cutter houses. James had never joined the HOA. They didn't build his house, they didn't pave his driveway, and they sure didn't own his land. Yet here they were, acting like overlords, demanding money for a tradition older than the association itself. He sat back in his chair, running a hand over his short-cropped beard. He knew what this was. The letter didn't mention it, but he could feel the real reason between the lines. Some of the new residents didn't like seeing him, a broad-shouldered black man in camo, carrying a rifle, walking across the woods at dawn. It didn't matter that he was a decorated veteran. It didn't matter that the deer population was overflowing. All they saw was someone they didn't want in their glossy picture of suburban paradise. That night, James laid the letter on the kitchen table and stared at it for a long time. His daughter, Alicia, who had moved back home after college, picked it up and frowned. They fined you for hunting. Daddy, that's your land. How can they even do that? James shook his head. They can't. But they'll try. The next evening, he drove to the HOA meeting. The clubhouse smelled faintly of air freshener and smugness. Rows of polished chairs were filled with neatly dressed families, sipping coffee from branded mugs. At the front sat the board, with Richard Coleman in the middle, the HOA president, wearing a tailored gray suit that looked more suited for Wall Street than a neighborhood gathering. When James's name was called, he stood. He didn't raise his voice, he didn't need to. His presence was enough. I received a notice yesterday, he began, holding the paper up so everyone could see. A fine for hunting. Let me make something clear, this land has been in my family for 3 generations. It isn't part of your community grounds. You don't have jurisdiction over it. I won't pay your fine. There was a murmur among the audience, but Richard leaned back in his chair with a smirk. Mr. Parker, all properties within the HOA's mapped boundaries are subject to our rules. Rules are rules. If you don't like them, he spread his hands dramatically, you're free to move somewhere else. A few chuckles rippled through the room. James caught the sneers, the sidelong looks. He felt the heat rising in his chest again, but years of military discipline kept his voice steady. You don't know who you're dealing with, he said simply. Richard raised an eyebrow, clearly amused. Is that a threat? No. James folded the letter neatly and slipped it back into his pocket. It's a promise that I'll handle this my way. And with that, he turned and walked out, his boots heavy on the clubhouse floor. The whispers followed him, but James didn't flinch. Out on the night air, he paused, breathing deep, letting the cool breeze clear his mind. He had been underestimated before, in the army, in life, in this very neighborhood. This was nothing new, but this time, they had picked the wrong man. James Parker wasn't a man who acted rashly. His military career had taught him the value of patience, of studying a battlefield before making a single move. And make no mistake, this was a battlefield, it just wasn't fought with rifles and camouflage anymore. It was fought with deeds, maps, and signatures on dotted lines. That night after the HOA meeting, James sat at his kitchen table with a fresh cup of coffee and spread out documents he had kept since inheriting the land. Property lines, tax maps, and an old survey his father had once shown him. The more he studied, the clearer the picture became. The WA wasn't just overstepping, they were bluffing, counting on intimidation and bureaucracy to scare him into compliance. But James wasn't a man who scared easily. He pulled out his laptop and began cross-referencing public land records with county databases. Years of military intelligence work had sharpened his ability to sift through details quickly. His fingers tapped steadily on the keys as late hours passed. By midnight, he found something curious. Several of the community's beloved hiking trails, the ones Richard Coleman bragged about in every WA newsletter, didn't belong to the association at all. James leaned closer, adjusting his glasses. The trails crossed into parcels still owned by an old timber company, land that had never been developed because of its rocky soil and dense tree cover. The WA had been treating it as their own for years, weaving it into their community grounds, marketing material, but legally, they had no ownership. James let out a low chuckle. Well, looks like somebody built their castle on sand. The next morning, he made some calls. His army pension had left him comfortable, and his side business restoring vintage motorcycles gave him extra income. He wasn't wealthy by any means, but he had resources, and more importantly, he had discipline. When the timber company's representative finally returned his call, James set up a meeting. 2 days later, he drove to a modest office in town, where a middle-aged woman in a navy blazer greeted him. Her name was Margaret, and she handled property sales for the timber company. "I'll be honest, Mr. Parker," she said, flipping through her files, "these parcels don't hold much value to us anymore. Logging companies aren't interested, they're too small, too rugged, and too close to residential development. If you want them, I'm sure we can make a deal." James kept his expression neutral, but inside, his pulse quickened. He asked for details, listening intently as Margaret laid out acreage, taxes, and restrictions. All told, it amounted to nearly 300 acres of wild woodland, the very trails the WA relied on for their reputation. And the price? Less than a flashy new SUV. "Why are you interested in these parcels, if you don't mind me asking?" Margaret said as she slid the folder across the desk. James allowed himself the faintest smile. "Let's just say, I don't like bullies. And I don't like people pretending they own what they don't." Margaret tilted her head, then chuckled. "I won't ask any more questions. Frankly, I'll be glad to get this off our books." By the end of the week, James was back at his kitchen table, pen in hand. He reviewed the purchase agreement slowly, carefully. When he signed his name, a calm satisfaction settled over him. Not the adrenaline of battle, but the quiet triumph of outthinking an enemy. He leaned back, picturing Richard Coleman's smug expression when James had stood at that meeting, letter in hand. Richard thought he held all the cards. He thought James was just another homeowner to push around, a man who would eventually bend or leave. But James wasn't going anywhere. As he closed the folder, Alicia walked in from the living room. "You've been at this for days, Dad. Did you figure something out?" James tapped the folder with one finger. "More than figure it out. I fixed it." Her eyebrows rose. "What do you mean?" James's smile widened just a fraction, a rare glint of mischief in his eyes. "Let's just say, the next time the WA throws one of their little festivals, they're in for a surprise." Alicia grinned, recognizing that look. She had seen it when he played chess, when he worked on motorcycles, and when he told stories about his army days. Her father was a man who never started a fight, but when someone forced him into one, he never lost. As night fell outside, James stepped onto his porch and looked out at the darkened tree line. The woods were quiet, alive only with the distant call of an owl. Those woods were his. Always had been. Always would be. But now, soon enough, the WA was going to learn the hard way that some men can't be pushed. Some men push back. And when they did, they'd realize that their prized hiking trails, their shining, community gem, belonged to the very man they had tried to fine into silence. James took a slow sip of coffee, the corner of his mouth lifting. "Check," he whispered to himself. The morning of the annual fall hiking festival dawned bright and crisp, the kind of day suburban families loved to photograph for their holiday cards. The WA had gone all out this year. Colorful banners fluttered from the clubhouse, tables groaned under trays of pastries and coffee, and children darted about with trail maps clutched in their small hands. The woods behind the community shimmered with red and gold leaves, promising perfect views along the trails. Richard Coleman, dressed in his trademark tailored blazer, held court at the trailhead. He was in his element, shaking hands, flashing that politician's smile, and bragging loudly about how their community amenities made the neighborhood one of the most desirable in the county. He talked about nature access, property value growth, and the safe, family-friendly environment they had all worked hard to maintain. James parked his pickup truck a little distance away and watched for a moment. He could see the smug pride radiating from Richard's every gesture. Families laughed, snapping photos near the "Welcome Hikers" banner. The board members stood nearby, beaming as if they had personally invented autumn itself. James stepped out of his truck slowly, his boots crunching on gravel. He wasn't wearing camouflage today, just jeans, a flannel shirt, and his old army jacket. Under one arm he carried a roll of heavy laminated signs, and under the other, a folder thick with legal papers. His face was calm, unreadable, the same mask he wore in combat zones decades ago. A few people noticed him as he approached, their chatter fading into murmurs. By the time he reached the trailhead, the crowd had grown quieter, all eyes turning toward the tall, broad-shouldered man in the worn army jacket. James didn't say a word at first. He unrolled one of the signs and, with steady hands, nailed it to the post at the trail entrance. The hammering echoed through the hush. When he stepped aside, the bold black letters stared back at the crowd. Private property, no trespassing. Trespassers will be prosecuted. Gasps rippled through the gathering. Parents clutched their kids closer. One man muttered, "What the hell?" Richard's face flushed red as he stormed forward. "Parker, what is the meaning of this? You can't just waltz in here and..." James reached calmly into his folder and pulled out the deed. He held it out, his eyes steady on Richard's. "I can. And I did. These woods, these trails, they're mine now. Legally. Every acre." Richard snatched the papers, scanning them quickly. His face paled. The signatures, the county stamps, the parcel maps, it was all there, undeniable. For a moment he looked like a man who'd been punched in the gut. This is outrageous." Richard sputtered, holding the papers aloft as though sheer bluster could undo them. "These trails have always been part of our community. You can't just close them." James's voice was calm, even, carrying easily over the murmuring crowd. "They were never yours to begin with. The HOA's been trespassing for years. I simply bought what didn't belong to you. Now, you'll respect the signs." A woman in the crowd whispered loudly to her husband, "He bought the trails." Others muttered in disbelief, while a few gave James quiet nods of approval. Tension rippled like static through the gathering. Richard tried again, louder now, desperation creeping in. "You're hurting the community, Parker. Think about the families, the children who use these trails." James cut him off with a look sharp enough to slice. "You didn't think about my family when you fined me for hunting on land that's been mine for generations. You didn't care about tradition, about fairness, or about respect. All you cared about was control." Silence fell heavy. Richard opened his mouth, but nothing came out. James rolled up the rest of his signs. "This festival is over. Anyone who steps beyond that post without my permission will be trespassing. And trust me, you don't want to test that." His voice wasn't threatening, it was factual, the way a soldier states the rules of engagement. For a long, strained moment, the crowd stood frozen. Then slowly, families began to drift away. Some parents muttered angrily at the board, others avoided eye contact, but no one stepped past the sign. The laughter and chatter that had filled the morning evaporated, leaving only the sound of leaves rustling in the breeze. Richard stood rooted, fists clenched around the papers. His power, his pride, his entire performance, all of it had just been dismantled in front of his neighbors. And James hadn't raised his voice once. James tipped his hat, turned, and walked back to his truck. As he climbed in, he looked over the scene one last time, the emptying crowd, the red-faced president, the banner sagging in the cool wind. He started the engine, the deep rumble filling the silence, and drove off down the gravel road. In his rearview mirror, the sign he had nailed up gleamed in the sunlight like a verdict. "Private property, no trespassing." Message delivered. The weeks after the festival felt like the slow unraveling of a sweater, thread by thread. The HOA had prided itself on those hiking trails. They were its crown jewel, the thing that kept property values high and new families pouring in. Without them, the neighborhood was just another suburban cluster of look-alike houses stacked along manicured lawns. And now those trails were gone, locked behind James Parker's private property signs. At first, the board tried to pretend it was temporary. They sent out glossy newsletters with vague statements like, "We are working diligently to restore access to community trails." But as the days turned to weeks, homeowners grew restless. Parents who had once boasted about weekend hikes now grumbled loudly at HOA meetings. Joggers complained that their morning routines had been destroyed. And the realtors, the lifeblood of the community, started whispering. Without trail access, homes weren't selling as fast. Prices began to dip. Suddenly, the premier neighborhood experience wasn't looking so premier. Richard Coleman bore the brunt of the anger. At the next monthly meeting, the once proud president stood at the front of the clubhouse, his voice strained as he tried to field the barrage of questions. "You told us those trails were community property." One man shouted. "You lied to us." A woman accused, her face red. "My kids can't even play back there anymore," another resident snapped. "What kind of neighborhood are we paying for?" Richard tried to calm them, spreading his hands in that polished politician's way. "We're pursuing legal avenues to regain access." But someone cut him off. "Legal avenues? You mean you never even owned the trails?" The room erupted into chaos. Board members exchanged nervous glances. Richard's smile cracked under the pressure. The man who once strutted through meetings with smug authority now looked cornered, desperate. Meanwhile, James Parker watched it all from a distance. He didn't attend the meetings. He didn't have to. Neighbors who once ignored him now drove past his property and slowed their cars, eyeing the sturdy fences he had put up and the clean new, "No trespassing" signs. Some scowled, others looked away quickly, but no one dared step foot past his gates. James's evenings were quieter now. Without hikers tromping through, the woods felt alive again with natural sounds. Deer roamed closer to his porch, unbothered by strangers. Birds nested without disturbance. For James, it was peace, the kind that couldn't be bought or regulated. One Saturday afternoon, while he was stacking firewood, Richard Coleman showed up. He wasn't in a tailored blazer this time, just a wrinkled button-down and slacks, sweat beading on his forehead. He stood on the other side of James's closed gate, trying to muster authority that was long gone. "James," Richard started, his voice tight. "Look. We need to talk. The community needs those trails. Surely we can come to some kind of agreement. Maybe a lease arrangement, or a buyback at a fair price." James set down the log he was carrying and walked slowly toward the gate. He didn't open it. He just stood tall, his arms crossed, and looked Richard square in the eyes. "You fined me for hunting on my own land," James said evenly. "You told me if I didn't like it, I should move. I didn't move. I didn't back down. I just bought what you thought you controlled. Now you're here asking me for favors." Richard swallowed, his bravado cracking. I may have been too harsh. But think about the families, the property values." James shook his head. "I think about my family. About my father and grandfather, who taught me these woods are more than just scenery for people to exploit. You didn't care about any of that. And now you want my help to save your board's reputation." He stepped closer, his presence looming, though his voice stayed calm. "You don't get to dictate terms to me anymore. Not here. Not ever again." With that, James reached forward, not to shake Richard's hand, but to swing the gate closed. The latch clicked shut with finality. Richard stood there for a moment, red-faced and sputtering, before retreating down the driveway. James turned back to his firewood, the matter closed as far as he was concerned. In the months that followed, the HOA's grip weakened. Angry homeowners voted out board members. Some families quietly moved away, tired of broken promises. The once pristine neighborhood newsletter shrank from glossy pages to thin black and white sheets, its tone defensive and bitter. Property values continued to slide, and with them, Richard's influence vanished. But James, he thrived. He hunted every fall, the same way he always had, uninterrupted. He spent his evenings on the porch with Alicia, sipping coffee and listening to the rustle of leaves. The woods were his again, untouched, unspoiled, and secure. And every time he glanced at the trailhead, with its bold private property sign, he felt the same steady satisfaction. The HOA had tried to strip him of his heritage. Instead, he had taken theirs. In the end, James didn't just win. He reminded everyone, quietly, firmly, that some men don't bow to rules written in arrogance. Some men write their own.